Bonjour, bonsoir. I'm Nadia Alexander and welcome to Mediator Academy's roundup of mediation news from around the globe. As usual, we'll try to be as informative and illuminating as possible. We might even be a little outrageous. This week, we're reporting from Paris, where I've been attending the 6th International Biennial on Negotiation. More on that later. Together with my co-presenter Davies, we'll also be sharing other exciting news from around the world with you on This Week in Mediation. Welcome to the show.
Hi everyone, from Mediator Academy's HQ in London. Let me tell you what we've got coming up in the show this week. Of course, as Nadia was in Paris, we'll be covering the 6th International Biennial on Negotiation. We'll be looking at the fate of the opening statement in mediation, and, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be covering a new form of mediation that is sweeping the globe. This is the opportunity, the hockey stick growth in the adoption of mediation that every mediator has been waiting for. So tune in for that later on in the show. But first, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to those of you that have posted comments. We finally managed to resolve the comment issue. We've now got a solid, stable platform that will mean you can add your comments, you can comment on other people's comments, and you can continue to learn. You'll also notice that if you're watching this show, you've progressed beyond the little turnstile that we put in at the beginning of the show. Now, we want to capture your details, not because we want to spam you or send you marketing information, but we want to find out a bit more about what you think of the show. I think this is the 6th show that we've done in a row. And what do you think? Is it useful? Is it worth getting out of bed for in the morning? And if it isn't, what would make it useful? What would we be worth getting out of apart from looking at Nadia and myself and listening to our dulcet tones? We want this to be useful. We want you to wake up in the morning thinking, I must tune in to This Week in Mediation. So you'll be getting a little email with some questions. You can drag that email into your delete box and be the few that won't open it, that's fine. Or you can be like the majority and click on the open button and just answer a couple of questions. That's all we ask. Okay, let's get on with the show. Now then, back to Nadia in the studio, and let's find out what was happening in Paris last week.
Well, Alan, as usual, there was a lot happening in Paris last week, but one of the more interesting things was the 6th International Biennial on Negotiation, where they call mediation N3.
N3, is that Nadia 3? Have they named it after you?
I wish, not quite. Well, it's like this. N2 is negotiation, 2 parties involved, and N3 with a third party mediator is mediation, and you can keep going on and on and on. And N10, for example, would be multi-party mediation or negotiation, I guess. Yes, so it's all in N's, and it just goes exponentially.
Don't you worry, but it doesn't sound like it was the regular ADR crowd there.
No, there were some of the usual suspects, but a lot of other faces. Experts in diplomatic negotiation, hostage negotiation, negotiation with terrorists, nuclear negotiations, and an emerging theme of complexity theory in negotiation, mirroring, if you like, the multipolarity of the world as it's becoming today.
The multipolarity, I can just about say that.
Well, at least you can say that. Well, Carrie Menkel-Meadow was there with among others, and in her presentation, she made an interesting comment. She commented on the fact that negotiation theories seem to reflect the zeitgeist in which they emerge. So, for example, distributive bargaining was very big during the Cold War, right? So zero-sum game.
Yep.
Interest-based bargaining emerged and became popular sort of during perestroika at the end of the Cold War and beginning of, around the 1980s. And now we are in a new complicated and complex era.
So the complexificationicity theory, the complexity theory.
Yeah, complexity, systems thinking, and so there are quite a few presentations on that and how that informs negotiation and also mediation.
Okay, so what were the major themes for mediators then?
Well, one of the big themes for the mediation part of this biennial was about the market for mediators. And there was one interesting panel from the US. Michael Moffat gave a paper with commentators Andrea Schneider, Chris Honeyman, and Sander Kaufman, and they basically talked about the fact that we know surprisingly little about the market for mediators. So, for example, who hires mediators? And what do people think they are buying when they hire mediators? Who do they hire as mediators, et cetera, et cetera? Lots of questions and very few answers.
Now, this sounds like a bit of a recurring theme. We had Michael McIlwraith on, I think was it the second show that we did?
It was.
I mean, that's the whole purpose of the Global Palm Conference, right? Is to try to address this whole issue, but do it on a global scale.
Yeah, exactly. And, and it's not necessarily easy to get a lot of information about mediation, because one of the reasons that we seem to know so little about the market has to do with the nature of mediation, its confidentiality, its informality, its variable relationship with the state, with the courts, with institutional players. So we talked around these themes, and Michael Moffat in his paper offered a whole lot of different images of what people think they are buying when they hire a mediator. He talked about people buying expertise or status, people buying efficiency in dispute settlement, or people buying wisdom, or someone to run the numbers for them, or people wanting someone with resources, for example, in political mediation, people buying access to a mediator's networks, or people hiring mediators because they make us feel good about ourselves, right? That we're not doing so bad, in fact, as we might think we are.
When I compare myself to that mediator, thank God, life could be a lot worse if I was like that mediator, right?
So there are a whole lot of reasons. Mediators as go-betweens, mediators because they teach us stuff, and that just makes it very hard to get a handle on the market.
Yeah, and do you think it's the same everywhere in Europe?
Well, I think it's a challenge. The market is a challenge everywhere in the world. At the same time, I think the mediation field in civil law Europe looks a bit different from the market in the US.
How so?
Well, I think, in many or most civil law countries in Europe, you've got a more, I guess, coherent regulatory framework. Most civil law countries in Europe have a general, fairly comprehensive law on mediation, which regulates different aspects of mediation. It's more structured, more unified. In a lot of common law countries, particularly in the US, there's enormous diversification, a lot of sort of very different regulations in different segments, sector-specific regulation and informal and formal. So it's hard to get a handle on what's happening in the US because it's different everywhere.
Yeah.
Also in Europe, in civil law Europe, the training model is generally very different. It's strongly facilitative, even transformative as the dominant training model. And in many countries, there's a no-caucus training model. So people are trained, and they usually do anywhere between 100 and 350 hours of training. So the training is more thorough, the assessment is more rigorous, and part of and often they're taught to have no private sessions or very limited private sessions. And this actually came up in the discussions because the panel of American commentators were lamenting the fact that there seems to be a drift away from the opening session in the US and a drift away from joint sessions, a move towards shuttle and keeping the parties separated the whole time.
I want to come on to an article from the Connecticut Law Tribune just in a moment, but I wonder, you talked earlier about the trend in negotiation being, particular to a period of time based on what's going on politically, socio-economic, all of that. I wonder if there's if the same is happening in mediation. Don't know, I'm just going to throw it out there.
Well, maybe that could be a question for our viewers.
Ooh. So the question, let's formulate that question, Nadia, coherently. And the question is, I'll give it. I'll have a pop at the question. Do you think that the development in mediation models is as a reflection of what's going on around us in the world, or is it an evolutionary development, or is it something else? What do you think is contributing to the evolution, development of different mediation models? There we are. That's the question. Moving on. What do you think of that, by the way, Nadia?
I think it's a great question. And it really picks up, some of the different themes and the diversity in the field. Jeff Sharp actually, when he was, I think it was in the Clue on Mediation blog a while ago, wrote a piece talking about the Californication of mediation. And what he was in fact talking about was this trend towards shuttle mediation coming out of California at the time.
Okay.
But it seems to be around different places in the US as well. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't seem to be a trend, at least in civil law Europe.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
well, let me come back to this article that was in the Connecticut Law Tribune, which relates a little bit to what you were saying earlier about the trend towards shuttle. So it refers to a study suggesting that despite the early conventional wisdom that it was essential to mediation since it enabled both parties to come face to face and agree on certain procedural rules, as more and more mediations took place, it was observed that letting the parties meet each other and make their claims in the other's presence at the outset itself could lead to feelings of discontent, which would not be conducive to the proceedings. Further studies conducted have shown that the use of the joint session has now greatly reduced. So what do you think, Nadia? Will shuttle take over the world?
Well, I think we're witnessing a growing recognition of diverse mediation models. Mm-hmm. And yes, if you look at the US, shuttle, and a lot of people are saying do away with the opening statement, but it's not the case in other places. And I think that while mediation needs to have very core values and core ethics, which everyone sticks to, the healthy development of process practice means diversity, which means shuttle, but also a whole range of other models. So I don't think it will take over the world, and neither do I think it should, but I think there's a place for it.
Yeah. So how do those two things fit together then?
The core values in the diverse processes?
Yes.
Well, imagine I was in the Moscow circus the other week.
Performing?
I was, and one of the acts was a high wire act, and so just imagine that high wire artist, right, walking along the high wire, and in order to stay on the wire, right, to survive, to get to the other end, the high wire artist holds usually a rod, right, okay. And what are they doing with that rod, Alad?
They are holding it and kind of wobbling it back and forth. Exactly,
in order to keep balance.
Yeah.
Right? In order to keep the core, right? To keep their core balance. So imagine this high wire is the mediation world, mm-hmm. right? In order to be a sustainable field, right? We need to be, in order to sustain our core values, right? To be true to our core principles, we need to move our bamboo rod, right? We need to be able to be open to diversity and open to innovation. So we need to be prepared to change, right? And not be dogmatic, right? And not say, no, we can't do shuttle, or we can't do a no caucus model, or whatever. Because the minute we do that, the minute we become dogmatic, at least this is what I think, the minute you fix that bamboo rod and you're on the high wire, what happens? You fall off.
Into the safety net.
Well, hopefully there is a safety net. At the Moscow circus there was.
Okay.
But in the mediation world, right, there mightn't be a safety net for us.
Yeah, the mediation, the real world of mediation where there isn't a safety net.
That's right, the harsh reality. So we've got to keep that bamboo rod moving. And never just let it fix, because, that'll be the beginning of the end, I think.
Yeah, so from the Moscow circus then, back to Paris, there was something else going on there, wasn't there? Tell us about it.
There was. So after the biennial, there was a group of people got together an international group. There were about 30 different scholars and practitioners in the conflict management field, and it was a symposium, a brainstorming day initiated by Andrea Schneider of Marquette University and Chris Honeyman, who's an independent mediator and author, both from the US. And they're really committed to advancing our collective reflections on the profession of mediation. So I guess a continuation of this market idea. And so the day focused on the challenges that the mediation field specifically is encountering in influencing the most intractable conflicts of our time. We've got so much conflict in the world, more and more it seems, but nobody seems to want us. Right. So what is that about, right? And so Peter Coleman from Columbia University facilitated the day using a reflection method that he calls SYNC. And I managed to ask Peter about the process he used, and this is what he said.
Peter, tell me about your approach to this workshop today in Paris.
So this is a group of experts in negotiation, and they were interested in exploring the idea of how can the field have more impact with sort of high-level politicians and leaders. And so we used a systems approach. It's an approach that Robert Sigliano and I are creating, which is attempting to help people who are not systems thinker and complexity scientists to understand how to do something new, how to change something, enhance the capacity for something, by getting a broader sense of the system in which it sits. So if you're trying to understand how to increase impact of a field, you try to think about, well, what are the various things around it that are either encouraging it or discouraging it, and how do they affect each other, and how does that context maybe allow for certain kinds of ways into that impact that you wouldn't ordinarily see unless you took the time to sort of understand the context in more nuance. So it's, in some ways, it's very similar to how people who are very familiar with a local terrain or a local context can actively affect that work in that context because they're so well informed. We oftentimes are asked to do things that we don't understand in a context that we don't understand very well. So it's really taking the time to really understand the history of a context, the current trends, sort of the energy in a community or something that might help it achieve whatever goal it's attempting to do. So we use that as a kind of a simple structure today to organize the conversation around impact in our field.
Whew. So with all this thinking and talking about mediation processes and mediation markets, I'm just wondering if in Paris they had their heads around this latest mediation market. Pet mediation, ladies and gentlemen, pet mediation. Nadia, go on, go for this.
Well, you've heard it first on This Week in Mediation at Mediator Academy. Indeed, according to Forbes magazine, there is a market for a growing, emerging market for pet mediation. So think barking dogs, biting dogs. Think custody disputes, and in the event that their humans divorce, what happens to these pets, to these animals? These are issues that can result in emotional upheaval and steep legal fees. Mm-hmm. So, pet mediation in a way follows the trend of mediation in other legal subfields, especially in divorce law, where mediators are growing in popularity for their ability to facilitate family disputes in a way that costs less money and sort of manage to help people experience less emotional turmoil than going to court.
Okay, so less emotional turmoil for the owner or the pet in question?
Well, given the rise of animal rights, that's a particularly excellent question, Aled, if I say so myself. There's little scientific doubt that animals are highly emotionally intelligent. Mm-hmm. Here's a story for you. This story was originally published on the Claw Mediation blog a couple of years ago by Diane Levin, and she called it A Dog's Tale. And it's a really moving story about a couple who, after many, many years of living together and running a business together, were divorcing. The only thing they agreed on was what they were going to do with their dog. and they were working in consultation with their vet and an animal behavioural expert to come up with a visitation schedule and a residence plan that would meet their dog's best interests.
A very special dog, by the sounds of it.
Well, indeed, and that's not even the mediation story. It gets better. So the parties asked the mediator, who I think was Diane, if they could bring their dog to the mediation. And she said yes. And so the dog came along and it had a place in a corner with a big bowl of water. And in the mediation, the parties began identifying and working their way through the various issues as you do with the mediator. And as happens in a mediation, one of the parties, for example, I think the wife, became sort of agitated and emotional, and something was very difficult. And as that happened, the dog walked over from his spot in the corner, sat by her leg, and rested his chin sort of against her leg, and she calmed down. Right? And then, as Diane tells the story, it then became the husband's turn, right? And he became emotional, and he became agitated, and he became upset, and his voice sort of lifted, and the dog went over and sat next to him, right? And put his head on the husband's lap, and then he managed to calm down, right? And this sort of went back and forth throughout the mediation as they went through issue after issue after issue. And then, as Diane tells the story, she says there came this make it or break it point in the mediation that every mediator knows, right? Yeah. Where, it could be an impasse and the parties could walk out. And there's this, suspense and tension in the room, and she's thinking about, what am I going to ask next? And as she's formulating her thoughts, the dog wanders over from his spot in the corner and puts his head on her lap. And the husband and the wife just stare at this dog in awe and amazement, and the tension in the room is released. They start laughing. People start to work through the issue, and the impasse is broken. And at the end of the day, when they reached a settlement, she said the dog was, bounding around, with the two parties who cared for him very much, but that this dog was really instrumental to helping the people move through this mediation. It's a very, very moving story.
Yeah, it makes me wonder whether pets themselves would be better mediators. I mean, I just think about my goldfish and how emotionally intelligent my goldfish is. Seriously though, there is apparently a handful of certified mediators nationwide who specialize in animals. I got them. This is very serious. Who specialize in animals. And I wonder whether a pet mediator needs to have certain special qualifications, or whether just any mediator can facilitate such a dispute. And I'm just mindful now, Nadia, that we've lost half our audience who are potentially pet mediators. This is serious stuff. But
well, look, I don't know whether they need special qualifications. I mean, maybe they do, but there's an interesting comment in this article from Forbes magazine about one mediator, Deborah Hamilton, who says that she specifically uses language in a way that recognizes the emotional intelligence of animals, and she challenges language that treats beloved companions, animal companions, like property. Right? So often animals are treated like property, but she said they're living, loving beings. And so I think you do need to have a particular sensitivity, which you might not have, Aled, to be a pet mediator.
Well, hold on a second. So it sounds like what you're suggesting there is that the pet mediator is looking after the interests of that pet. That raises some concerns for me. To what extent is the mediator being, for want of a better word, impartial? Just throwing it out there.
Look, it's a great question, and I think the same question you can ask in family mediation, because in many jurisdictions, the family mediator has a duty to look out for the interests of the child.
We're on this high wire again, aren't we?
We are on the high wire. And loving it.
Okay. So, Nadia, Moscow, now Paris. Where are you off to next week?
Well, very happily, next week I'm going to be back in the studio in Berlin as normal.
Well, I shall look forward to next week's show. That's all we've got time for this week. Remember, pop your comments, questions, feedback in the comment section below the video. All that's left for me to say is goodbye from this week in mediation in London.
And it's goodbye from this week in mediation in Berlin.
See you next week.